Hi, everyone. I'm here with the Honorable former Assemblywoman, Catharine Baker. Catharine, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great and great to see you, Brian. Thank you for including me in conversation. And from my living room, which is where I spend 20 hours of my day anymore with all of our Christmas decorations, I hope you are doing well and that everyone in your life is staying healthy and safe these days.
I am, and I promised you at some point the one AirPod would fall out. So one did, but I still got another one. So I'm going to roll with that. So
Go
thank you.
for it.
And it's been a big week for you. Congratulations. You were just appointed to the Fair Political Practices Committee. And I'm sure a lot of folks aren't super familiar with that. Can you share a little of what that is and what you're going to be doing in that role?
Sure. The Fair Political Practices Commission, or FPPC, anyone who has ever served an elected or appointed or public office in California or run as a candidate would be a little more familiar with this, but our everyday civilian may not. It is the five-person independent nonpartisan commission that's tasked with enforcing and overseeing the education and outreach about government ethics and transparency in our government and accountability. And kind of break that down a little bit, they really come from the Fair Political Practices, or excuse me, the PRA, the Political Reform Act, that was passed in 1974, shortly after the Watergate experience our country had. I was just a little tiny thing back then. I don't have a firsthand memory of it, but and the idea is to promote government ethics, transparency in campaign finance and in lobbying activities, and to try to ensure there are not government representatives who are self-dealing with taxpayer resources, with campaign resources, or that there are conflicts of interest between government service and an individual elected or appointed behavior. And it's a great work. They do outreach and training, and they try to be making sure that all candidates and lobbyists and officials know about their duties and obligations. And they also are an enforcing body. They actually have a team that enforces those provisions through civil enforcement fines. So it is a great honor. I've practiced election law for probably about 16 years now, and almost entirely pro bono, and loved the work. It was all towards transparency and accuracy in our elections. And so this is a little bit of a shift, but very much aligned with what I worked on the assembly. And I'm deeply honored to get to be one of the commissioners.
Well, I think it's such an interesting time to be talking about it because we've just completed the most expensive presidential election in history.
Yeah.
And one of the things that shocks me is if you go back 20 years to the Bush versus Gore race, where George W. Bush did something that was very cutting edge at the time, which was he opted out of the federal matching funds because up until then, pretty much every candidate went ahead and they raised a certain amount of money and then that got matched, and so you had to have a certain number of donors, and then that got matched with federal funds. And now, I mean, that notion is completely antiquated. What do you think about the role of money and how that's changed politics over the last couple of years
Sure.
or decades?
Yeah, well, a few small points and then to the bigger
Yeah.
point as well. On the small side, the Federal Elections Commission, FEC, is sort of the FPPC equivalent for federal elections. Just a little distinction that
Right.
listeners may not know. The commission that I've just joined is the California equivalent, and so actually it doesn't oversee federal regulations, but plenty at the state level. And there are campaign spending thresholds and spending limits that candidates in California can opt into or not. And there are amazing loopholes about that, big surprise,
Right.
that tend to benefit the political parties. So for example, when I was a first time candidate in 2014, which seems like ancient history,
Hmm.
I had the option of agreeing to spending limits, which are a calculation of prior years. The limit changes every cycle. Or I could decline that and decide to raise my own. If you agree to the spending limits, as well as fundraising limits, you get to have a statement in your information brochure. So, when you are
Right.
looking at that packet that's sent to you right before elections, and sometimes you see a candidate statement and sometimes you don't. You might wonder to yourself, I heard this all the time. Well, gee, this candidate didn't care enough to put in their statement. Well, you only get a statement if you agree to the spending limits. And the spending limits favor those who are likely to be funded by their political parties, because the one exception to the spending limit is when political parties spend on your behalf or give you money. So for example, a candidate could come in and agree to the spending limits, saying that, oh, I'm going to be, not spend more than, let's say it's $700,000. But that's actually not accurate, because their party can come in and spend millions and cut
Unlimited
those
amounts, right?
connections. Yeah. And they get the benefit of the little statement that goes to every single voter. Anyway, I got a little esoteric there.
Yep.
It's one of the examples of loopholes that people don't know about. To your bigger question, money in campaigns, it's always going to be there. It is part of our free speech, and people will debate Citizens United and if there should be spending limits or just transparency. I experienced it very firsthand, because my race in 2014 was the most expensive assembly race in all of that election cycle, between how everybody spent. There were about $9 million. And I raised 700,000 of that. I was the small spender in that one.
Yep.
So look, it's here. I think the important thing is that there are pretty well established and rigorously enforced rules about transparency, and that the information that's available to voters is accessible. It is not gobbledygook that you can't understand, and it's not filtered through someone else where they get to say, make their own judgments about what's disclosed. And I think that, to me, has always been the better way of regulating the role of money in campaigns, is as much transparency and timely as possible. Rules have it so that a lot of those provisions you don't get reported about till well after an election. Well, that doesn't do you very much transparency good. Anyway, I have my soapbox about those issues, but I've been on the receiving end of the experience.
Well, you went through not just one, but three of the most expensive assembly races in history. And I'm presuming if they're the most expensive in California, they're among the most expensive probably ever in the United States. And
even more expensive than some congressional races, depending on where in the country you're comparing. It's also an expensive media and communications market, but yes. Yeah.
Well, it's kind of an incredibly expensive media market. And then the fact that in California, we have so few competitive districts on both the state and the assembly. And so naturally the money gravitates to that. What is it like going through a campaign in such and I mean, I imagine that from the day you won in 2014, you immediately then, because you have a 2-year cycle and really it's nonstop campaigning. What is that like for you, and what sort of impact does that have as a legislator as well?
Oh yeah, I probably would have worked just as hard had I been in a quote safe seat, not a swing seat, because I'm a compulsive overworker, over prepare, over everything. It's just kind of the way I am. But I learned shortly after I was elected in 2014, probably 72 hours later, I started hearing this talk about, oh, you're going to be a target. You're a target. You're the number one bullseye on your back. And I thought, I would be I'd always have elections that required a lot of hard work, and didn't really have this concept that is really lingo in Sacramento about targets and protects. And I learned pretty quickly that the whole infrastructure in the legislature that's not on paper is really about who are the targets on the other side, and how do we try to defeat them in everything we do legislatively, and who are the people on our side that we try to protect. So I was typically, and this was not a function of my personality or relationships, it was just because I was a swing district, I typically was the number one target and the number one protect. And when that happens, a lot of money, outside money, tries to get involved in races. There's very expensive independent expenditures. And so that's just a function that you see all around. We just saw it with the congressional races in Orange County the last 2 years. And I learned that you do start running for reelection almost immediately upon election in a swing seat. If you want to be elected again, you have to really work hard. The experience I had, you asked me what's it like in the legislature, that most demonstrated that was shortly after I was sworn in, another member, who I'm not going to reveal, came up to me, member of the other side, and said, I don't envy you one bit. And I was like, really, this is a great honor to get to be involved in. And what makes you say that? And this individual says, you're going to have to work so hard, like 24/7, and always have to be looking behind your back and everything else. And I don't have to do that. So I just don't envy you at all. And I joked, I said, well, gee, I'm a twin mom. I always do things a little bit harder, or I worked hard to get here. But as the member walked away, I thought, what is it like to think to yourself, I don't have to work that hard because I'm in a safe seat? And I think safe seats have their benefits, but I think one of the things that's going to be interesting is there should be more swing seats. There should be more of it. I think it leads to people more open-minded about working with others and not get complacent in their seats.
Do you think the open primary, so it was the top Democrat and the top Republican who were facing off, and now with the open primary, which was passed under Governor Schwarzenegger, that it's the top two vote getters in the primary, and so you can have two Republicans or two Democrats. Although to date, currently it's still overwhelmingly incumbents are going to win. But for an open seat, you might have two Republicans or two Democrats. Do you think that changes the dynamic at all, or does that not have much of an influence because incumbents are still so powerful in that scenario?
Well, incumbents are still very powerful for sure. So, but I think we've had enough experience now with the top two to see that it can be a moderating effect. It won't necessarily be because money will get involved, but I'll give you a couple of examples. So I think you'll find Reggie Jones-Sawyer is a member in Southern California. He's chair of the Public Safety Committee. He's a member of the Democratic Party. He was challenged by a member of his own party, and it was a top two race. He barely made it out of the primary in March, if I remember the numbers correctly. This was a sitting assembly member, and millions of dollars were poured into that race down where he is. And a lot of big interests got involved. The police and state public safety officials and their unions got involved, as well as other sitting assembly members trying to protect their own multi-million-dollar race. He ended up winning, but so it didn't change. I don't think it changed Reggie's voting record at all. I don't think it had an impact on him that way, but it did make it a very expensive race. And I worked with Assembly Member Jones-Sawyer on different issues. So in that respect, all it did is make a more expensive race, but it might have made someone, I don't know this, but he was in a really safe district, and that's kind of a wake-up call sometimes for members that might be needing a little wake-up call when you get a challenge like that and it's from your own party. But that's an example of also the incumbency will help you. Then you'll find other areas of the state where you might get a moderating impact. I'm thinking of Senator Rubio down in Southern California. She's part of the Rubio sisters. One is in the Assembly, one is in the Senate. I admire both of them very much. When her seat became available, that was another example of a choice between a potentially more moderate or independent-minded Democrat and one that was considered much more party line or maybe more union interests. And a lot of money was put into that from outside forces to try to have the more centrist person, and she ultimately won. So that does happen, and I think that's the impact of it now. It happens a little bit less in Republican seats because there are so few of them. I mean, there are so few of them. I think we now have 19 seats out of 80 seats in the Assembly. So it does have a moderating impact. It can also have the impact of just throwing a lot of money into a race that had someone just maybe worked a little harder, they would have run anyway.
Yeah. And to that point, I mean, you were the last Republican legislator here in the Bay Area, and now it's entirely Democratic. And is that, in your mind, and there hasn't been a Republican elected statewide in quite some time. Is that the electorate in California has changed so much and in the Bay Area? Or do you think that it's a larger message for the Republican Party? What do you think the cause of that is? And how does the Republican Party return to relevance in California?
Well, first, I think it's both in terms of how we got there. The electorate in California since the mid-90s has changed. And certainly in terms of even our economy, we're not as much a defense manufacturing or economy is driven as we were 25 years ago, when was the last time the mix up in the Assembly and the Senate was very, very close. I think Republicans had the majority for about 9 months in 1995 or so. But so that has happened. The party has definitely struggled and lost registration and lost seats over that 25-year period, with the exception of a few blips on the screen that I think are important. One was in 2014. In 2014, we picked up assembly seats, all in swing districts. I think we picked up 5 or 6 seats, including the one that I had been in. And when I won in 2014, it was the first time a Republican had been elected anywhere in the Bay Area legislatively in 8 years, but the first time a Republican flipped a Democratic seat in 30 years in the Bay Area. So it was a big year, but we did it elsewhere in the state. So there's some recent history of being able to pick up seats. Just this last election cycle, which was really a surprise to me, demonstrated that the Republican Party, for as much as it's been on the downswing, it still has pulse in California. Yep. And I think we saw that in the outcome of the ballot initiatives and in the seats that were picked up, and that not a single assembly seat was lost in a presidential year. And I don't know if, you may know this because you get into the data points, but most Californians don't know. In presidential years, Republicans have always lost assembly seats for the last 22 years, every single time, because there was higher turnout. And sadly, Republicans would lose when there was higher turnout. And this did not happen. So it's really quite extraordinary to find another time when we have not lost seats in the assembly in a presidential year. Of course, that didn't happen in the Senate, but so I think it's been both. It's the trajectory that the party has taken generally, and California has changed. And I also think that the most recent election has shown, not only 2014, but 2020, the party still has those who will share its principles. It's what we do going forward to bring people in and to deserve to govern.
And one of the, I think interesting parts of the election was the fact that it has been a little bit overshadowed, that with Joe Biden winning the election, and yet the Republicans picked up seats in the House. They had gains in other areas. Here in California, some of those seats that had flipped in 2018 have now flipped back. Right. And I guess part of me feels like, considering that happened, it makes it harder to understand how people believe that there is this huge conspiracy that somehow Democrats had only, they had the wherewithal to go ahead and plot this huge conspiracy to help Joe Biden get elected, but didn't bother with any of the down ballot races.
Well, and that also Republican governors and secretaries of state were in on the conspiracy. So it's pretty hard to believe. I'm not one of those conspiracy theorists. I've been vocal about that. And I think every election, especially one with such an amazing turnout as we had in this last cycle, which is not just impressive in California, but the country, will have issues. And some of it might be fraud. Some of it is, and I'd say 90% of it is misapplication of the law, changing the rules as you go along. There are legitimate problems with those issues. And I hope that we will find a time when we take away the partisan lens that we look through in the presidential election and look at, okay, what can we do better in elections generally? Both the good things we need to improve on and the things that are broken. But he won legitimately. Yeah. And it just still continues to boggle my mind how many people in real positions of authority see it as a grand conspiracy. And I don't think that's going to change necessarily. I'm not one of the conspiracy theorists, but
which I appreciate.
Yeah, well, I've practiced election law for 16 years, as I mentioned, and most of that has been in the area of the casting of ballots, protecting equal protection rights when it comes to your right to vote, increasing accessibility, and fighting to ensure that votes are accurately counted and people are not disenfranchised. I have observed in 7 or 8 counties in California, in different states, from local races to presidential races, and our system is not rigged with fraud. There are opportunities for it. the unscrupulous can do it, and in close races, it makes a difference. But our system is one of the best in the world. Anyway,
And
you got me
so
on the soapbox on that one.
no, which I appreciate, because I think it is. I mean, it's the first time in history and where we've seen close elections before, but we've never seen anything quite like this. Where, and this is actually if you go back to 2000, the 7th out of 8 times that the Republican presidential candidate has gotten fewer popular votes, and really, it's the Electoral College that has allowed the Republican Party to have relevance on the presidential side of it. What do you think is the disconnect there in terms of the Republican Party messaging? Are there certain issues that rather than the cultural wars and things like that, is certainly the at a national level where you've seen attack on immigrants and things like that's been counterweighed with changing demographics. What do you think are the lessons for the Republican Party from a bigger picture standpoint?
Well, I think first and foremost, and I'm by no means an establishment Republican. I was probably during my time in elected office in the Assembly, I was the most critical of the president of any elected, I think, in California in my party for 4 or 5 years. So I'm not. I come at it from that lens, first of all. And I'm looking at the successes of the 2020 election and where we failed in the past. And there's no question to me that it is start with good people, good candidates running. There were excellent candidates who ran this cycle, focused on their communities and the job that they are running for, and also hardworking candidates. That helps. That's not always the case. Sometimes you'll get candidates who are so ideological and they're only running on one issue that does not jive with their community, and that's not going to work. So I look at that, recruit good candidates for sure, and focus on the issues that matter in your district, and earn the vote or deserve to govern your community. Easy for me to say because I'm currently a civilian and out of that, but I think it starts with recruiting good candidates. And then secondly, really focuses on the issues that most matter to everyday quality of life. And I'm going to push back a little bit on the idea that only Republicans have a disconnect, maybe in California, but certainly not in other states. This was a close election, and while I think Biden, it was surprisingly close. I mean, I was going into election night expecting a dramatically different result in a lot of races, and we have the narrowest Democratic majority. I think is it in 2 decades since they have this small, just a single digits majority. Totally didn't expect that. You had a lot of down tickets, split ticket races. Look at the way Californians voted on some of the propositions, Prop 15, Prop 19, and Prop 22, just by way of examples. So I think there's, depending on what state you're coming from, I know we're both in the Bay Area and California. I don't know that there's that kind of disconnect. There certainly has been in California, and the turnaround comes from great candidates running and reflecting the issues that are most important to their communities and how they're going to improve lives. And I think that my colleagues in the Democratic Party, with whom I've agreed on many things, I'll have a real soul searching to do as well, not only in California, but nationally.
I agree on the national part, because I think many Republicans and Democrats were surprised that a historically unpopular president who managed to contract COVID at a super spreader event at the White House right weeks before the election, on top of so many other things in terms of mishandling of the coronavirus, came down to just a handful of states that it narrowly had gone for Donald Trump in 2016, and those same states narrowly went for Joe Biden, even though the popular vote was very decisive. The 306 electoral votes, it was just a handful of states. And so I think that's something that the Democratic Party does need to do some soul searching and wonder about. And the fact that and I think another interesting thing you said was the fact that you touched on earlier, that traditionally in presidential election years, that benefits Democrats. And Newt Gingrich was just quoted as talking about we're in trouble if a lot of people vote. That's not good for Republicans. But in this election, higher you would have thought that this high turnout would have hugely benefited Democrats, but
Right.
there are a lot of Republican wins as well. Let me ask you
It's true,
closer to
because
home.
I've talked to some folks who I've asked them, what do you read that? And they say there's a lot of, this is political consultant speak, but there's a lot of untapped, unmined votes in California. That's what they're looking at. They're saying, well, there are people who came out that show us there's opportunity. And so we'll see, what happens from that. It's a very political analysis, but extraordinary that a high turnout election yielded such a close election. I can't underscore enough, if you're not in the data points or Politico, that's really very unusual. And I often say to Republicans, if you're afraid of turnout and you want low turnout elections, something's wrong.
That's not a good indication. No.
Yeah.
And let me ask a little bit closer to home here in terms of Governor Newsom, who, I think that early on in March and in April, I think that there was a lot of support for Governor Newsom in terms of being very aggressive, and the fact that California did not have the huge spike that we saw, even though hit early here, that we saw in New York and New Jersey and some places like that. But with this latest round of shutdowns and gubernatorial orders, that there seems to be more and more anger towards Gavin Newsom. And then there's also anger, I think, towards the fact that people are just so frustrated that here we are 9 months later and we're still in this pandemic. What are your thoughts about that and the job that Governor Newsom's done, which is it's certainly not an easy job.
It's not an easy job. In his time in office, he has not only had a global pandemic, but the wildfires, electricity shutdown, housing policy that has not been fixed. Let's face it. We also have some parts of the state that before the pandemic were still in double-digit unemployment. If you look at Imperial County, when other parts here in the Bay Area, it was maybe 3%, 3.2%. This was before the pandemic. And we still have a state that has many problems beforehand. I think, look, it's easy when you're not the one having to make the tough decisions. It's just that there've been some really bad ones. There was not only the French Laundry, which was so incredibly disconnected from the everyday life of folks. We know that. But there's the big open business commission that had, 100 people on it. I represent and work with small businesses. We all are patrons of them in our local communities. They're not seeing any benefit to this commission that was supposed to help them. And when the commission had a report come out, the commission was, well, we should be really conscientious about small businesses and try to support them. It was that kind of work. And that's the kind of thing that frustrates people when they see EDD, that department, not only rife with fraud, but a complete inability to fix any of the problems. And no one really in the governor's office so far taking the reins and saying, I am going to fix this because it is unacceptable that it's happening in my time. When the DMV was completely unable not only to meet the appointment times that people needed, but accurately register people to vote, there was no leadership saying, all right, I'm taking this on and I'm going to fix this. I didn't cause the problem, but I'm going to try to fix this. And we just keep seeing that again and again. So that's even without a pandemic. Mm-hmm. On top of that, our schools and our kids not being able to go to school has been so terrible. I'm a parent of high school students going through their senior year in basically the same room, their bedroom, every day, all day, and seeing what's happening there. So again, it's easy to pile on and criticize them, but there have been some really big missteps and a disconnect. And we were already there before the pandemic. I think it's been worse. He did some great leadership in shutting things down in March when we really didn't know what we were dealing with. And that did take some courage. And I think it probably did help us. But it's been confusing all year what to expect. So anytime, you always want your elected leaders to more than just make a statement or a policy or just a vote up or down. You want them to lead, like roll up their sleeves and own it and fight for it. And we need that now.
Yeah. And, I come from a school background and, have 4 kids in schools myself. And I think there's a huge frustration that kids are not back in, but it seems that a joint federal and state response to this would have gotten us so much further. And I think too, and to me, it's not even a Republican versus Democrat issue. It's just an issue of competence. And if we had had, I think that Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush, if a president had come forward in March or April and said, my fellow Americans, we're faced with this enemy like we've never seen in our lifetime, and this is a unified national effort. We need to shut down. We need to wear masks. We need to invest in testing and roll that out. What if we had had something like that? How different do you think this potentially would have been, and would that have helped the states? Because it seems like that is a huge miss, and probably I think that's probably going to be Donald Trump's greatest legacy.
I think you're right there for sure. I mean, from everything I've read and studies that have been done on this, and I'm by no means, I'm not going to pretend to be an epidemiologist or even someone who can work with statistics very well, but I can tell you, I've read, as I'm sure you've seen, how many lives could have been saved had we done certain things earlier and had some consistency in leadership and messaging. And I couldn't agree with you more on the flaws at the federal level and the missed opportunity. And it wasn't just a missed opportunity where, okay, now we're going to have housing costs that are higher or something else. People die or have long lasting effects. So certainly difficult to see happen. But I'll offer the flip side of that as well. And it's a challenge that Governor Newsom has that hasn't quite been able to crack. Having just a federal, every one size fits all, or federal takeover of it wasn't the solution either, because there's parts of our state that we're seeing now that are so dramatically different than others. You have to have some amount of common sense and be nimble. And I would love to have seen more leadership at both the state and federal level and help us find that special place that allows us to be nimble at a local level. And hopefully we'll see a change in that. And look, I agree with the governor here. We're in the tunnel. We're still in the tunnel, but at least there's a light at the end of it.
Yep. And I think, and I will agree with you on that. And one of the things I appreciate is that President-elect Biden has said he's against blanket shutdowns. Instead, looking at this idea of 100 days of everyone wear a mask. And, I think that when we look at outdoor dining, when I think there's some places that we've seen have done it really well, schools, and having a focus on providing testing and getting schools back, that how much of a difference could that have possibly made? Because, I think one of the huge pieces that we're only really starting to see is the economic impact of this on, our state finances and what this is going to look like. And the question I had for you is that, here in California, we feel heavily taxed because we're one of the few states that has sales tax, property tax, and income tax, which is and those are all high. And yet from like a school standpoint, we're around 40th in the nation on a per capita basis, which is really challenging because the cost in an actual dollar amount, that I think that's even lower, because if you think of what you pay to a teacher here compared to a teacher in Mississippi or Arkansas, like those dollars don't go as far. It's even tougher on our teachers and our custodians and office managers. What is, from your perspective, kind of at the root of that? Why do we've paid such high taxes and yet we chronically underfund schools here in California?
So there's a couple things, and there will be some who push back and say that there's a different metric that maybe we fit within the 20, we're 25th out of 50. Well, I fall into the boat that I just know this. Our local schools do face a chronic shortage in funding. And there's a couple of issues that go along with that. The first is one that is politically, sadly, not going to be fixed, and that is how we spend it. I just have to tell you, we still try to fit everything, innovative ideas have to fit within the infrastructure of our school systems now. And if we don't fit to the way we do things, it just doesn't get done. We don't see reform, again, in teacher tenure, in professional development reform, and in the kind of things that have been so successful in other states that over the last decade saw they were doing poorly in performance and education. I still believe firmly in those changes. I think it's politically difficult to do. I supported bills to change teacher tenure by like 1 year. And those always faced, survival instinct opposition. But also on there is that a lot of what happens with schools is you're asking them to do more. We are also faced with the pension costs that are in our school system that our local school districts now bear much more of over the last several years. You know that, having looked
I
at
do.
school budgets.
Yep.
And were you provided more money from the state to meet that? A little bit from time to time, usually one-off payments, but not nearly enough.
Yep.
And that's still something that has not been fully addressed. And you also have a situation where the pie is not getting bigger. So let's say, for example, when we put money from the lottery into schools, well, that's a very small amount of the state school budget, but that was money. We were perfectly happy to not continue to increase more funding after that. Everybody believed that, we're going to be fine if we just have the lottery take care of it. The last couple election cycles, we've had measures on the ballot, tax measures in 14 and 16, 2012 and 2016, if I'm remembering my years correctly, like short-term tax increases to save our schools. Never did it because we really weren't increasing the pie for schools. We were slicing it up differently, but we weren't making it bigger. I think one of the number one things we can do right now is change the local control funding formula so that all the money goes into the base grant, which means everybody does better when you're going to increase funding instead of just in the categorical and sub grants. And we're getting into kind of wonky formulas here, but I think that's one of the most important things we can do for local districts in this area, and make the pie bigger.
And the making the pie bigger part is because I think, one, people see the headlines around schools get more funding, but when the costs that are attached to the school district for the retirement funding are larger than the increase, that your spendable dollars have actually gone down. And
yeah, you're not really digging out of the hole when that happens.
right.
Yeah.
And one of I think there's
Can I
always
say this though, Brian? I do want to emphasize this. I still believe you could put, I was queen and you were king for a day, where you could just waive all the money that all of our school districts ever asked for and you gave it to them. We still might not see dramatically different outcomes if we don't change how we spend it, with the innovation in the classroom, the quality of teaching in the classroom, and the accountability for it, the quality of principals and administrators. And I think that's where we still ignore that. And that is something that deserves just equal time with money.
And along those lines, one of the frustrations I had as a public school board member was with charter schools. The fact that for a long time they are operating under a separate set of goals. And so even though we talked about, charter schools, there's a benefit because they are more nimble and things like that, they weren't operating under the same rules and having the same guidelines for transparency. What are your thoughts around that? And I know we've seen some changes, but has it been enough? And should charter schools be held to the same standards as public schools?
Well, I certainly think charter schools should be held accountable. Charter schools are public schools. They're just, they are part of our public school system, as you know, and public dollars do go into charter schools. That's sometimes a misconception that I try to remind people
and
about.
You're right, and I misspoke on it. Yep.
And I am also a just ardent believer that when parents can are empowered to make choices to match their individual child with the best teaching environment possible and put those dollars there, it's not only good for, yes, competition, but it's brilliant for that child and that family. So I'm a very strong supporter of choice, but they absolutely should be held accountable. And I think, my district saw not only great charter school systems, but ones that were poster childs for failure from lack of accountability and transparency. And there was legislation recently, the last 2 years, I believe, and I believe Senator Glazer might have been an author of it, if I'm keeping track of things appropriately, that I think made great progress in the transparency and the authorization and oversight of charter schools. But I think if we say, gee, they don't have to abide by the same rules, well, that might be what really makes that might be what gives people more choice and is a good secret sauce. I will also add, they may not be have to comply with the same rules as schools, but they still had to comply with some oversight. For example, I used to see this all the time. Charter schools, they don't have to abide by the same disclosure and conflict of interest rules because they're governed under corporations code instead of education code. Well, I'm like, there's a corporations code conflict of interest provision that did apply to them. So it wasn't like a, free for all Lord of the Flies in terms of compliance. So I'm someone who does firmly believe as a parent that it's how terrific it is to be able to pick the educational opportunity that matches best with your child and have the ability to get them there. But accountability is something anywhere your dollars are spent. It has to be enforced rigorously. There's more work to do in that area. What I hope won't happen is, I think the last few years, there was a governor, and that was Governor Brown, who was a little more friendly or balanced in his approach to charter schools. I think that's changed over the last 2 years, and we'll see what happens with the Biden administration.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that Jerry Brown, when he was mayor of Oakland, he was a very vocal proponent of charter schools. And as kind of a last topic, in terms of the role of government, there's, you often hear from Republicans the idea of smaller government. But let me ask you something that, I think going back to President Eisenhower, who built the highways and, investment there, I think there's some certain core things. And one of them that's close to my heart is around internet access. And I think we are massively seeing the shortfalls. We're seeing it in my district. We're seeing it throughout California. And, I've actually said for a number of years, instead of us investing over $100 billion in high-speed rail to connect our state, that if we spent anything close to that amount of money to instead digitally connect our state, is that an appropriate role for government? Because I don't think that private enterprise is alone going to do that. And I think that is the type of thing where there is a role for the government. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, sure. I mean, you're absolutely right about the inequality in access to high-speed internet is even in my community in Dublin. I'm in Tri-Valley, which is called the Innovation Valley. And we have major centers here of tech companies and families who probably earn a living in the technology industry. And it's still a challenge, even in this area. But there's some parts of the state that when I went to the legislature, I will confess, I didn't realize just how bad it was for some parts of our state where they don't have that type of access. So there are many private initiatives and nonprofit organizations that are focused on it. As in terms of the role of the government, it is where can you partner with the private sector? Where do you have to be the ones who lead, and not just partner, but you have to lead and take it on? And then when do you hand it over? When does it become more self-sustaining and able to support itself? I also add this: you always have to think about what level of government. It's not always federal and the highest top level. Actually, it's a core Republican principle that I still firmly believe in, the concept of federalism, which is devolve things as much as possible to local decision-making. You're much more nimble and people are much more in tune with what their community needs. You can't do that with internet access. It can't be something that a small town up in Northeastern California can do all on its own. But you want to find ways in which I think that's appropriate role of government, that type of basic infrastructure where you're either partnering or you're having to take the lead role, but eventually is it something that you turn over to make it more self-sustaining? And I would add this: I hope we can get past it, because the inequality that students are dealing with now for not even who can be in the classroom and continue learning and who can't is aggravating it so badly in a state that really has a gap that we should do better at. I mean, that sounds a little bit Pollyanna, but I hope we can tackle it.
I think we have to. And as a final question, you're well decorated for the holidays there behind you. And so there you go. And there's been so much negativity and so many challenging things in 2020. Let me ask you, what are you looking forward to in 2021?
Well, first and foremost, I'm looking forward to vaccination for people who are total strangers to me, who I'll never meet, but whose life might be more, they might be alive and their family might be together and economically able to enjoy life because of the vaccine. I'm definitely looking forward to that. And hopefully a resumption of life. It's going to take getting back to normal. It's going to take a lot of time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. So there's no question. I'm looking forward to seeing the risk to life reduced because of the vaccine. My kids graduate high school in the coming year. I'm looking forward to work on the FPPC. And just since this is a political conversation, I was looking forward to a new administration, a change from where we've been for the last 4 years. And I hope that the discussion of compromise and unity and more attempts at bipartisanship really will happen, because we've been starved for that for too long. And there's too many leaders who don't have a practice in it anymore. They're just entirely too ideological. And I'm looking forward with hope that that will be a good development in 2021.
I will share many of those wishes. So Catherine, thank you so much. But it's been such a pleasure, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
I'm delighted. I appreciate the outreach, and I'm wishing you and everybody who listens to this health and safety for everyone in their lives, and all the best in 2021. I was on a call recently where they said, wishing you all the fun in 21.
We'll take it. Thank you so much.
Good to see you. Take care. Best wishes.